United States Constitution created a republic that has lasted over 200 years, but it was not the first national government of the United States of America. That distinction goes to the short-lived Articles of Confederation, without which the Constitution, as it exists today, might never have been formed. During the war, the colonies stopped being colonies and instead became self-governing states. Benjamin Franklin, a philosopher, statesman, and kite-flying enthusiast, had become fascinated with the Iroquois Native American people who formed a confederacy of 6 nations. The Iroquois Confederation inspired the Articles of Confederation. After over a year of debate and revision, the Continental Congress presented the states with their new Articles of Confederation. The Congress had done their best to create the government that the states wanted, one that left them free to govern themselves without any congressional meddling. The Articles became, if not the law of the land, then at least its semi-official rule set. They're more like guidelines anyway. Congress had just been printing money, literally. Need to buy military equipment? Print some money. Need to pay your soldiers? Print some more money. By the winter of 1777, they had printed so much money that it had become practically worthless. When Washington tried to purchase supplies from the local farmers using that money, they wouldn't accept it and sold those supplies to the British Army instead for good, reliable pounds sterling. Each state began to treat the request from Congress for more money as entirely optional. If they couldn't see the immediate benefit for themselves, they wouldn't pay. Congress could do nothing without the aid of the states, and the states had become too wrapped up in their own concerns to help. Realizing that Congress had no real power, the delegates themselves began to ignore their duties. Time after time, meetings of Congress had to be disbanded because over half the delegates simply didn't bother to show up to vote. If this country was to survive, they needed to handle their financial situation and establish a reliable source of revenue. I'm getting to you, Hamilton, okay? Chill. And prove to the watching nations of Europe that they were not a government on the verge of collapse. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no real leader. They needed to create new leadership roles. Most importantly, they needed to appoint a superintendent of finance to fix their desperate money troubles. They nominated Robert Morris, the richest man in America, but he did not want to do it at first. Americans hated taxes so much that they had literally gone to war with the greatest military power in the world to pay less of them. And now Congress had nominated him to be the guy who got to step in and say, "Hey, we need you to pay some more taxes." Morris established the first national bank and used it to create a new stable currency backed by actual gold and silver. But still, states were ignoring Congress letters to pay up. The soldiers who fought in the war only received IOUs as Congress could not pay them. Robert Morris found a new ally in a young politician named Alexander Hamilton. See, I told you I'll get to you. The famous hero of Yorktown and George Washington's right-hand man, who joined the Congress in 1782. Morris and Hamilton bonded over their shared love of national banking systems. Because everyone's got to have a hobby. Hamilton writes letters to Washington to warn him of how close things were to falling apart. Since the Treaty of Paris granted the new United States the lands west of the Appalachians, Congress now controlled the land, and they set up rules for how the land would be divided up and sold. Once these new territories reached a population of 20,000, they would join the Confederation and become states. Problem was, British soldiers still stayed in many of their western forts, ready to pick up the pieces when the new United States fell apart. Both Europe and America had begun to take bets on when that would be, since it seemed inevitable at this point. States were printing their own money in open defiance of the Confederation. States had begun fighting amongst themselves. Connecticut and Pennsylvania were at war over a border dispute. Newspapers had begun openly calling for the states to break apart and form new confederations. For many, this seemed natural, as their states were their home country, not some vague idea of a continental union. But the revolution that had begun had grown out of their control, and a new generation of American statesmen saw things very differently. Men like Alexander Hamilton have fought in the war alongside soldiers from all 13 states, and the one thing that had brought them together was this idea of America, a country that belonged to all of them. Hamilton refused to let his new country fall apart, but years of serving in Congress had convinced him that this weak Confederation government could not be fixed. It had too many fundamental flaws. It couldn't fund itself. It couldn't enforce laws. It couldn't even get its own delegates to show up half the time. Now, to convince the new states to replace the Articles of Confederation with an untested new constitution that gave the central government even more power, that would be an uphill battle. But Hamilton said, "Challenge accepted." Hamilton had won tough battles before. Hamilton insisted that they all look at the big picture. Did they really want to keep a country running like this, arguing over every river and every trade route that they shared with their neighbor? Wouldn't it be easier if they had some central authority whose job it was to decide these matters? Someone like, I don't know, Congress? Reforming the Articles of Confederation started, but only 5 of the 13 states even bothered to attend the first meeting. If Hamilton wanted to change the government, he needed to convince them all to attend the next one. Hamilton needed George Washington. Washington had wanted to replace the Articles of Confederation since watching his soldiers nearly starve to death at Valley Forge, but he had since retired home to Virginia and sworn off public life. He didn't want to use his fame as America's first general to become a dictator. But if he attended, Hamilton knew that important people from every state would want to be there. Hamilton turned to his friend and fellow congressman, James Madison, for help. They both convinced Washington to come. Madison had read philosophies and histories that helped him to build a counter-argument to every possible objection about the evils of a central government. He compiled a list of every failure of the Articles of Confederation, and he convinced them all to adopt his Virginia plan, a plan that called for the Articles of Confederation to be abolished and replaced with a new constitution. In 1787, at the Constitutional Convention, the Virginia delegation laid out their plans to replace the Articles of Confederation. Hamilton and Madison led the debates that picked apart the Articles' flaws and recast them into a centralized government with powers specifically granted to deal with all the issues the Confederation Congress had struggled to resolve. There will be more floor debate over how much political power each state should have, with the smaller states not wanting to be left out. What they came up with was a compromise that will result in the bicameral Congress that the U.S. has today. Together, Hamilton and Madison created the United States Constitution. It is not perfect. There are still clauses about how slaves should be counted into the population for voting purposes. That ended with African slaves counting as 3/5 of a person. Yes, this Constitution is full of contradictions, and it would need a lot of amendments that will be added over time. But it stands today as the oldest Constitution that's still active, and that's pretty cool.
Eruption's such an old song that we can sing along in harmony. You know, where is it stronger than in Albany? His colonies, economies increasingly stalling, and honestly, that's why public service seems to be calling it. I practiced the law, practically perfected it. I've seen injustice in the world, and I've corrected it. Now for a strong central democracy. If not, then I'll be Socrates throwing verbal rocks at these mediocrities.
Hamilton at the Constitutional Convention.
I was chosen for the Constitutional Convention.
There is a New York junior delegate.
Now what I'm gonna say may sound indelicate.
Goes and proposes his own form of government. His own plan for a new form of government. Talks for 6 hours. The convention is listless.
Right, young man.